Canto 3, Chapter 15, Text 24. Ye vyartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna. Ye vyartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna. Jnanam cha tattva vishayam sahadharmam yatra. Jnanam cha tattva vishayam sahadharmam yatra. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Samohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Samohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Ye vyartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna. Jnanam cha tattva vishayam sahadharman yatra. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Sammohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Ye vyartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna. Yang cha tattva vishayang sahadharmam yatra. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Samohita vivataya bhatamayayate. Ye vyartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna. Jnanam cha tattva vishayam sahadharmam yatra. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Samohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Ye vyartitam apichano grinakim prapanna. Jnanam cha tattva vishayam sahadharmam yatra. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Samohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Ye bhartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna. Jnanam cha tattva vishayam ramamam yatra. Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamusya. Sammohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Ye, those persons. Abhyartitam, desired. Api, certainly. Cha, and. Naha, by us. Brahma and the other demigods. Nrigatim, the human form of life. Prapannaha, have attained. Jnanam, knowledge. Cha, and. Tattva vishayam, subject matter about the absolute truth. Sahadharmam, along with religious principles. Yatra, where. Na, not. Aradhanam, worship. Bhagavataha, of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Vitaranti, perform. Amushya, of the Supreme Lord. Sammohita, being bewildered. Vitataya, all pervading. Bhata, alas. Mayaya, by the influence of the illusory energy. Te, they. So this verse translates as, Lord Brahma said, my dear demigods, the human form of life is of such importance that we also desire to have such life. For in the human form, one can attain perfect religious truth and knowledge. If one in this human form of life does not understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his abode, it is to be understood that he is very much affected by the influence of external nature. So we can do this responsibly. Lord Brahma said, my dear demigods, the human form of life is of such importance that we also desire to have such life. For in the human form, one can attain perfect religious truth and knowledge. If one in this human form of life does not understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his abode, it is to be understood that he is very much affected by the influence of external nature. So here is the purport. Brahmaji condemns very vehemently the condition of the human being who does not take interest in the personality of Godhead and his transcendental abode, Vaikuntha. The human form of life is desired even by Brahmaji. Brahma and other demigods have much better material bodies than human beings. Yet the demigods, including Brahma, nevertheless desire to attain the human form of life because it is specifically meant for the living entity who can attain transcendental knowledge and religious perfection. It is not possible to go back to Godhead in one life, but in the human form, one should at least understand the goal of life and begin Krishna consciousness. It is said that the human form is a great boon because it is the most suitable boat for crossing over the nescient ocean. The spiritual master is considered to be the most able captain of the boat, and the information from the scriptures is favorable winds for floating over the ocean of nescience. The human being who does not take advantage of all these facilities in this life is committing suicide. Therefore, one who does not begin Krishna consciousness in the human form of life loses his life to the influence of the illusory energy. Brahma regrets the situation of such a human being. Ye vyartitam apichano nrigatim prapanna jnanam cha tattva vishayam sahadharmam yatra Naradhanam bhagavato vitarantyamushya sammohita vitataya bhatamayayate. Lord Brahma said, "My dear demigods, the human form of life is of such importance that we also desire to have such life. For in the human form one can attain perfect religious truth and knowledge. If one in this human form of life does not understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his abode, it is to be understood that he is very much affected by the influence of external nature." Burijan tells us that this particular section of the 15th chapter of 3rd canto is Brahma glorifying Vaikuntha. So the first, as we said before, the first 10 verses of this chapter were about the spreading darkness, which was the womb of the two beings in the womb of Diti, which were Jai and Vijay, of course, now become Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha. Then, after hearing about this spreading darkness from 11 to 22, we heard about how the 4 Kumaras journeyed to Vaikuntha Loka. So that was the next section. And of course this sets us up for learning about Jai and Vijay. So from 23 to 25, so that's where we are right now, we hear about this glorification of Vaikuntha. And from 26 through 37, we hear about how Jai and Vijay are impeded from getting into the gate of Vaikuntha and therefore curse Jai and Vijay. From 38 through 45, we're going to hear about how the Supreme Lord appears. He's watching the whole thing on his closed-circuit TV, so he can see that there's a little bit of a tiff going on in front of the entrance to Vaikuntha, and he comes out. And then finally, from 46 through 50, the last few verses are about the 4 Kumaras offering prayers. So that's kind of how this chapter is kind of a complex chapter. It has 6 parts. So this particular piece, 43 to 45, is said to be about the glorification of Vaikuntha, but really it's the glorification of the earth plane. Because people who are in a human form of life, living on the earth plane, are in a good position in a particular important way. And the reason that they're in a good position is that on the earth plane, things are neither too heavenly nor too hellish. If you live in the hellish worlds, you've been delegated to go there because of your sinful life, you're in too much pain to think about going back home, back to Godhead. On the other side of the coin, if you're in the heavenly planets where Lord Brahma is, there are many heavenly planets, you are enjoying too much to think about going back home, back to Godhead. But here on earth, we get a nice mix of hell and heaven. So it's not so hellish that we can't think about going back home, back to Godhead, at least most of the time. And at the same time, it's not heavenly enough that we get lost in enjoyment. Although we see that even though the enjoyment in the material world is pretty minimal, still people somehow manage to get lost in it. Otherwise, everybody would be going back home, back to Godhead, and we see that this is not the case. So the material world certainly has all kinds of suffering. But generally people don't learn from this suffering. They just suffer. And they wind up simply repeating the same mistakes they made time and time again, because the course of a lifetime over and over again presents various situations, and generally a person makes the same mistakes because he's focused on the same material goals. So he makes the same mistakes towards achieving those material goals. And this is called samskaras, a very deeply etched pattern of misbehavior. And so when the person dies, his body is taken from him, the karmic mechanism grants him another body at some point along the line. Then once he has a new body, the next thing is that these samskaras go with him in the form of the subtle body, and he carries out the same mistakes over and over again. So this is the unfortunate situation. And so how would anyone ever get out of such a trap? And of course the answer is only due to the mercy of the devotees who canvass through the earth plane and spread the knowledge and glories of the Supreme Lord that awakens those people who are doing the wrong thing over and over again, awakens them to a possibility that they had never thought of, at least not thought of seriously, and that is that you can learn about the Supreme Lord. So, in 5th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, I thought of this verse immediately when I read the purport in the verse today. We have Nayam Deho Deho Bhajan Riloke Kastan Kamad Arhate Vidbhujamye Tapo Divyam Putra Kayena Sattvam Yasmad Sudyad Brahmasokyam Tvanantam. So this is Rishabdev speaking to his 100 sons, and he's giving a summary, Nayam Deho Deha Bhajan Riloke Kastan Kamad Arhate Vidbhujamye Tapo Divyam Putra Kayena Sattvam Yasmad Sudyad Yasmad Brahmasokyam Tvanantam, that my dear boys, those who have been granted a human form of life should not work very hard day and night, just simply for sense gratification, which is available even to the dogs and hogs who eat stool. Rather, one should perform penance and austerities to come to the divine position of devotional service. By such devotional service, one is purified and attains to the highest position, which is beyond the material suffering that the fools and rascals endure and have to go through, and it lasts forever. So this is kind of the meaning of that verse. That's 5.5.1. It's the first verse of the 5th canto, 5th chapter. And so this is in the same theme that generally the child grows up, he's surrounded by a society that has no information. So what should the child understand? He grows up and he learns that there's sense gratification and that feels good, And he learns that there is various kinds of unwanted situations, and those feel bad. And so as Bhaktivinoda Thakur mentions, that therefore the child learns to maximize his material happiness by finding the right kinds of sense gratification and minimize his various sufferings that he comes across from meeting with unfortunate circumstances. And this becomes the entire purpose of his life. And why should he think anything else? There's no information. So this is why knowledge is such an important thing. Knowledge of the Supreme Lord, knowledge of Vaikuntha, and knowledge of how to go to Vaikuntha. So this is why knowledge is so important. If one doesn't have knowledge, one assumes, again wrongly, that the whole purpose of life is to maximize our material happiness and to eliminate various kinds of suffering. It's just the natural conclusion that a person will come to. He sees everybody doing it. He's doing it. It seems quite straightforward. Nothing, no rocket science going on there. But it's a futile attempt, and it's a pointless attempt, because there's a better game to play. And it's only until the living entity comes across, the words of some transcendentalist somewhere, that he realizes there's something different other than chasing after material happiness and avoiding material miseries. So this is the purpose of the human form of life. Prabhupada says that the human form of life is a junction. In the human form of life, one can go up or down. In the animal species, one can only go up. And in the demigod species, one will only eventually go down. So, generally speaking. So, in the animal species, one will go only up. So, because of someone's past bad misbehavior, the karmic system operated by the demigods and tuned by, also very mechanical principles that are like law books, like the Manu Samhita, which give various punishments for various kinds of sinful acts. So a person will suffer in hell, possibly, then be relegated to an animal form or lower, a plant form possibly, or even further down. So how many forms of life are there? 8,400,000 species. So if you fall down, you got a long way to go to come back up. Of course, 400,000 are just human forms, or humanoid. In other words, demigods are lumped into that. Aboriginals are lumped into that. So those that are at the high end and the low end of the human form. So those who have absolutely no knowledge about anything, and then those who have extreme knowledge and powers like Brahma. They have not only an understanding of how the universe works, they are part of the universal administration, so they do that as well. This system is fine-tuned to give a person the results of their karma. So what's interesting, and I bring this up every once in a while, is that when we hear a verse like this that we're hearing today, we can understand that Krishna consciousness can be described differently according to the metaphor being used. It can be described differently. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as rising in the three modes of nature. that we're going from ignorance to passion and ultimately to goodness. Sometimes we hear that the process of Krishna consciousness is described in rising in the modes of nature. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as controlling the mind. If we control the mind, then we are becoming Krishna conscious. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as controlling the senses. Of course, to control the senses, one has to control the mind. So 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Those two are closely related. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as gaining an affection for the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as perfecting your japa. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as getting free from material desire and eliminating all the samskaras that we've developed over many lifetimes. So sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as purifying the heart. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as learning how to perform unbroken devotional service. Sometimes Krishna consciousness is described as gaining transcendental knowledge, which is what we're talking about today, gaining transcendental knowledge. All these things are nothing more than different metaphors for the same basic thing, for becoming focused on the Supreme Lord in the ultimate issue and going to Vaikuntha, to the spiritual world. So this is what Krishna consciousness is really all about. But sometimes, as we say, we talk about it in terms of 3 modes of nature. Sometimes we talk about purifying the heart. Sometimes we talk about it being focused on the Supreme Lord. Sometimes we talk about giving up material desires. Sometimes we talk about controlling the mind or controlling the senses, etc., etc. So these are other ways to describe the same process, the exact same process. And if you perfect any one of them, you've essentially perfected them all, because sometimes, for some of us, it may be easier to think in terms of controlling the mind, or it may be easier to think in terms of perfecting one's japa, or it may be easier to think in terms of rising in the modes or gaining transcendental knowledge. But for the most part, if you're doing one of these things well, you're essentially doing all of them at the same time. You're becoming attracted to the Supreme Lord. And this is the real purpose of human life. A person who does not know this, and most people do not know this, they're wasting their lives. And what will happen? At the very best, if they don't perform egregious sinful acts, they will have another human body, at the very kind of best, generally speaking. There are a few tiny percentage of people who will go to the heavenly planets, but most people, at the very best, will at least get another human form. But a lot of people, because of the fact that they're unable to control their material desires, they don't know they should be controlling their material desires. They don't know what the consequences are of not controlling their material desires. Such people will wind up in Yamaraja's court. They may have to serve some time in the hellish worlds. Then, after that, they'll wind up in a lower form of life, where there is no opportunity for religion. You cannot give religion to dogs and hogs. They're not able to grasp religious principles. So a person has to wait then until they come back to human form again, before again there's a possibility of religious life. So this is why we hear over and over again, Prabhupada really pounds the idea of human form of life. This is basic Krishna consciousness. You are a human being. What does that mean? That means you're encased in a body. That body is not you, but for the moment you are in the body, and the way you use the body will govern what happens next. So, and we generally know that most people get immediately sidetracked by sex life. Pumsam striya maituni bhavametam tayar mito hridaya grantim ahu ato griha kshetra sutapta vitar janasya moho yamaham mameti. Again, in Canto 5, this is chapter 5, text 8. 7 verses after the first one that I quoted, also from Rishabdev. And he's saying attachment between male and female is the basic principle of material existence. Based on this misconception, which ties together the heart of the male and female, one becomes attached to body, home, property, children, relatives, and wealth, and this way always thinks in terms of I and mine. So this is the trap door. And most people have no idea it's there. They don't know how to avoid it. They don't know they should be avoiding it. And therefore, naturally, it's how they waste their lives. And they lose the chance at a human form, at actually perfecting the human form. They don't know they are in a very good position to get out of the material world. Instead, they unfortunately use their good position simply to expand their contacts of sex attraction, and they use their human form to enjoy the senses. And they have no idea that this is a waste of life. But strangely enough, many people do recognize at the last stages of their life that they have wasted their lives, but they have no idea of exactly what they should have done differently, So it's kind of like a real sort of ironic note that people go out of the world realizing that they've wasted their lives, but not exactly knowing what they should have done different. For the most part, they think, I should have spent more time with my family. I shouldn't have been knocking it out in the office as much time as I did. But that's not really what they did wrong. What they did wrong was they paid no heed to talks, as we were hearing yesterday by our Prabhu Vishnu, about the Supreme and his abode, Vaikuntha, and how to go there and why to go there. Of course, this is what we see, that in general there's no knowledge of any of these things. And that's why going out on Sankirtan and meeting people gives people, for the first time, their first glimpse that there's an alternative to living a life of searching after sense gratification and eventually making worse and worse mistakes and getting pulled down into material existence. So let me ask if there are any questions or comments. Yes, Jimmy.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you for the excellent lecture. I was wondering in the purport, Prabhupada's purport, he mentioned that in the human form of life that one can't go back to Godhead in one life. But I was wondering, because the motto I've been hearing a lot in our movement is go back to Godhead in this life in one lifetime. So I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah. I caught that too. It's in the purport where Prabhupada says that one cannot go back in one life. But usually he says that one should go back in one life. So what's up with that? Well, I'm not able to give a definitive answer to that, but what comes to my mind is that generally speaking, we can go back home, back to Godhead in one life with the following stipulation. We live, say, a good life of spiritual Krishna consciousness. We will take birth somewhere in the material plane again, but this time in the association, direct association with the Supreme Lord or his pure devotees. And at that point, we will actually be able to perform a relationship with the Supreme Lord in an intimate way. So right now we are learning and we are becoming purified in our everyday activities to try to become purified. We call that sadhana bhakti, but we know beyond sadhana bhakti there's what we call raga bhakti. But between raga and sadhana bhakti there's raganuga bhakti, or following in the footsteps of great acharyas, or the devotees of the Lord. If you read Nectar of Devotion, you'll see that there are gradual stages where in sadhana bhakti we are performing various regulations. We eat a certain way, get up at a certain time, we do certain processes every day. And all these are done because we don't have any automatic or any spontaneous love for God. These are regulations. That's what sadhana bhakti is all about. But to actually enter into Krishna's pastimes, you have to be in raganuga bhakti or ragatmika bhakti, So to be in full devotion, one already has to understand what their service is in the spiritual world, and be fully situated in that, and understand who is a director of their service, exactly how it's carried out, who are other members of the same group that one is working with. This is very esoteric knowledge. One doesn't get that knowledge until one's gone through Raganuga Bhakti. So in the Raganuga Bhakti, between Raga Bhakti and Sadhana Bhakti, one becomes acquainted with the details of how. And this is kind of the stuff that we always get, from some members of the Gaudiya Mat, saying that they have the higher thing, that, Prabhupada didn't give us the real deal, that we were starved of real understanding that we can hear if we hear, divine pastimes in great detail from the mouth of a Rasika Bhakta, So this is the kind of stuff we sometimes run across, But this is not actually the fact. Prabhupada gave us everything we needed. And so if we follow sadhana bhakti, then we will become qualified for raganuga bhakti. We will take one more life. But that life will be in a setting where we will be in the actual perimeter of those who are in raga bhakti. Will be trained up, and then we'll go back home, back to God. In other words, one more life, So that's just my way of addressing it. So in one sense, to be in direct association of the Supreme Lord in one of his pastimes in the material world is like going back home, back to Godhead, but little different. And so that's kind of what, or we could say that this idea here that one goes back, one cannot go back in one lifetime. Prabhupada could be alluding to the fact that most people don't do it in one lifetime, but it may take more than one. Not that it's impossible not to, but generally speaking. Yes, we have a question over here.
Thank you very much for the lecture. If we accept that these words of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Golokera Prema Dana Harinam Sankirtan.
Yeah.
If we accept that it is not just advertisement of Harinam Sankirtan, what the use of so much stress that we have to go back to home, back to Godhead, it's so on and so forth, and we can see it's so complicated, different kinds of level and studies, but if we just accept that Golokera Prema Dana Harinam Sankirtan here on the New York Street, New York Street. Why we don't so much stress this point, Golokera Harinam Sankirtana? Why?
Well, there's
Sorry, my English is
right. If I understand your question correctly, you're saying why don't we just focus on chanting the holy name and outside to attract people and forget about everything else? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Why we not so much stress importance of Harinam Sankirtan?
Why we don't?
Why we don't?
Right. Well, in general, we do, at least in this temple. We stress quite a great deal. However, there's something that I think a lot of people don't focus in on. Prabhupada explains it in Bhagavatam that we have what's called Bhagavata Marg, and we have also what's called, what's it called again? What's it? Yeah, Pancharatrika Vidhi. So, what's the difference between Bhagavata Marg and Pancharatrika Vidhi? So, Bhagavata Marg is the process of chanting the holy name. As we know, that we hear in the Shikshastakam, we chant every morning. Lord Chaitanya is saying that you're so munificent, you haven't made any rules and regulations for chanting. So, at least theoretically, we could go back home, back to Godhead by just in a completely non-scheduled, chaotic way, just continue to chant. However, that's not what we do. Instead, Prabhupada says there are two tracks. There's Bhagavata Marg and Pancharatrika Vidhi, So, what is Pancharatrika Vidhi? Is the Narada Pancharatra, which we get from Narada Muni, is what we hear in the Nectar of Devotion, other places, where we hear these details about rising early, serving the deity, exactly how one serves the deity. And so we have these two tracks, and Pancharatrika Vidhi is not eternal. Eventually we will cross beyond the need for Pancharatrika Vidhi. But it is the whole system of detailed rules and regulations of how someone purifies themselves so they have a good chance that when they actually are performing Bhagavat Vidhi, when they are performing the chanting, that they'll be doing it in the right consciousness and they will understand the importance of it, which is, I think, even more of an issue. If you just hear about chanting and how important it is without some structure involved, there's a good chance that you won't take it seriously. You'll do it for some time, and then you'll think, this is strange. Why am I spending so much time on this? But if it's in the web or the matrix of an entire whole lifestyle of rising at a certain time, living in a certain way, avoiding certain sinful activities, etc., then we do Bhagavata Marg in the right context, and therefore it can have its effect on us. And eventually, Bhagavat Marg is what will pull us into the spiritual world. But without, Pancharatrika Vidhi, there's a good chance that we won't be doing it in the right mood, and our material desires and our offenses will multiply enough that it'll snuff the whole process out before we get to purified Bhagavat Marg. So I think in the second canto or something, I forget where it is that Prabhupada talks about these two things, that these are two tracks. And so that's why Prabhupada didn't just, he started out by going to Tompkins Square Park, and he played a little drum and people danced, but it didn't stay that way. Even later on, when there was 26 Second Avenue, people would come, he would feed them, they would hear him give lectures, and he would do some kirtans there. And then they would go home. But eventually, Prabhupada established deity worship, morning classes, living in the ashram, doing devotional service, following four regulative principles. In the beginning, there were no even regular principles. Prabhupada didn't even mention those, and we hear in Leelamrita that the devotees would come to 26 Second Avenue, and after Prabhupada was finished giving his lecture and they ate something, the devotees would go across the street and smoke cigarettes and drink coffee and eat donuts in the diner on the other side of the street. And so Prabhupada eventually put the kibosh on that by saying that henceforward anyone who considers to be my disciple must avoid these four things. And he put a sign up on the wall, that one should not engage in meat eating, one should not engage in intoxication, including coffee, tea, and cigarettes, and et cetera, et cetera. He put that up, and that was the first the devotee had ever heard that there were some rules to this whole thing, It wasn't just chant Hari Bol and, that's it, So this is why there is the Pancharatrika Vidhi. So it puts us in the right mental space so that we can actually perform Bhagavata Marg properly, and it will eventually carry us into spiritual life proper. Is that what your question was? Okay. Any other quick question? We have one quickly here from Arjuna.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you for the lecture. My question was, speaking of the four regulative principles, so I was wondering what all does each of the principle include? Because no meat eating means one may not touch meat, but there may be some more aspects to it. So each of them may have some things.
Well, generally, from what I understand, the four regulative principles are there, that they're, said in a very simple way when a person takes initiation. Usually the initiating guru, the Diksha guru, he asks the disciple, do you intend to chant 16 rounds? And they apply in the affirmative, and they say, what are the four regular principles? And usually we say no meat eating, no intoxication, no illicit sex, and no gambling. So that's kind of the overview. As far as intoxication goes, we know that in general, even coffee, tea, cigarettes, and these kind of things are within the category of intoxicants, although coffee and tea aren't quite so serious as some of the other things. Of course, at one time, Prabhupada had to include LSD and, a bunch of other, interesting substances that devotees were prone to drift off into. So he made that too. And as far as, we find that we shouldn't eat meat. Of course, in general, we see that in our food we also avoid mushrooms, onions, garlic, etc., etc. But these aren't actual regulative principles. They're just, when we're cooking food for the Supreme, we don't offer him things that he doesn't like, So that's, I kind of don't consider that in the same category as, the idea of breaking the regular principles by eating meat. That generally means eating meat, of course. Eggs and fish, some places, particularly Bengal, the fish is fruit of the ocean. No, it's not fruit of the ocean. I think Paul McCartney said it best by saying that if it has a face and it runs away, don't eat it, That kind of sort of puts it in the right context, So that's kind of what it is. And these are our 4 regulative principles, and that's how I would.
What about gambling?
And well, gambling, right? Gambling generally is, since time immemorial, there's always been people who have wagers with one another over either dice or some event or whatever it is. Of course, we can extend this towards the stock market and speculative businesses and things like that, but then we're starting to get into, again, gray areas where, it might be better just to stick with the basic stuff. Of course, if gambling, I think, generally is the idea of trying to get something for nothing. Somebody was giving a class just a short time ago mentioning that was kind of a good definition for gambling, that you're trying to get something for nothing. You're not performing a service, you're not making a product, but you are making some arrangement with another person that if either the dice turn out a certain way, or the cards turn out a certain way, or the roulette wheel or whatever it is turns out a certain way, or if an event happens the way that you predict it rather than the way they predict it, that's gambling. And you will get some kind of money or some kind of resource as a result of that wager, So this is breaking the regulative principle. Okay, so we're 5 minutes over time, and thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Haribol.